What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds for 114 days now, going up to 365. And in today's video, we're going to be going through the happiness equation of a builder, the problem that ultimately revolves around this, and the insights that I've been able to get, and as well as my builds, basically adding more context to how I've been able to build more progress, and that ultimately has been a result of my happiness in terms of building each and every single day, and also just some mechanisms to apply that can be applicable to anyone that ultimately wants to build. So this is just my own take of how I've been able to experience this and things that I've been able to see along my journey. So the problem is that most people chase motivation, but motivation fades, and I'm a big proponent of this, of understanding that most things ultimately come as a result of compounding actions that you take on a day-to-day basis. And I'm one of those people that understand that motivation is one of those things that get people hyped, but it's not the thing that ultimately gets them across the line, or to run the marathon. At least it's not the thing that ultimately allows them to push through those days when things just don't seem to be flowing their way. And it's also happened to me multiple times where I've had to realize that the motivation that I was facing in that specific point in time was ultimately not going to be the thing that would allow me to then power through. And motivation only lasts so long before it ultimately fades. And understanding that motivation is going to fade, you can feel pumped for 30 minutes to an hour, or even a day, or even 2 days, 3 days, but ultimately understanding that motivation alone isn't going to be the result that's ultimately going to get you to where you need to get to. Like, for example, for me, if I was just solely reliant on motivation in order to build out these daily videos, then I wouldn't have done even 30, because there were so many days where I felt motivated to make these videos, and some days where I simply just did not. And that is the reality of a builder, from my experience, that you're gonna have those days where you don't feel like producing and just making stuff, but you ultimately have to power through that. No matter how you feel, you just ultimately have to just show up each and every single day. And that is what these videos are for me, this log that ultimately allows me to hold myself accountable as well, to just show up each and every single day and understand that value ultimately comes as a result of progress that I'm making on a day to day. And without visible progress, people stall, which is why most people quit at day 10, 30, or even 50. Simply because when the progress is not visible, like you can't see the results of what it is that you've been doing for 10 days straight. Because I personally believe that nowadays we live in a world where there's so much instant gratification and so many things happening right now that it's easy to overlook the compounding aspect of things happening and taking time. I mean, I like to think about this all the time whenever I get a somewhat impatient, which is you look at your Elon Musks, you look at your Jeff Bezos, you look at your Mark Zuckerbergs. It took a very long time for them to get to the stage that they're at, and who am I to think that I can basically shortcut that process? And that ultimately keeps me grounded, in the sense that if I want to be a hardcore builder and I want to be an operator, like a operator that operates at the highest level, then I need to make sure that I'm just doing the boring stuff each and every single day, because that's what the people that I look up to and I respect their work have done consistently, day in, day out. They never looked back on what they were building and said, hey, I'm just gonna solely rely on motivation, and that motivation only lasts so long before it fades. And then also understanding that the secret is ultimately not finding inspiration, but in reality it's ultimately understanding that the real driver is creating momentum, and asking the questions of how can I then create momentum that ultimately compounds on a day-to-day basis. And even you can look at it from a granular perspective and say, how can I build this momentum on an hourly basis that ultimately compounds into the things that I do daily, that ultimately drive drives the vision forward. And that ultimately leads us to understanding the mechanisms that we ultimately need to pull in order to create that momentum that ultimately, moves us forward. Because momentum is super important. I've, realized, in points and times when you pick up momentum, you pick up that momentum wave, you just need to double down on it and ultimately, ride with it, because you never know how long that momentum is gonna last. And most people celebrate, that momentum, when momentum strikes and they hit this peak and they say, hey, let's celebrate, let's do all these things. But for me, I've always seen momentum and these peaks as a point of reflection where I can ask myself of how can I basically double down during this time, because the low points are definitely going to come into the future. But then how can I now, just focus on doubling down and building that moat that ultimately drives, the next level that I'm ultimately pushing for. And also understanding the insights that I've ultimately been able to gather from this, which is that human beings are wired to crave feedback loops. And what this basically means is that if you output something, then you ultimately need to, have this thing, or us as humans have this thing where we need to get something else in return for that. Just basically those feedback loops. And you can see how daily output creates the micro progress, and that micro progress ultimately compounds, and that compounding creates momentum, and from that momentum you then able to fuel happiness. And this ultimately comes as a result of understanding the flows that each and every single micro progression that you're making leads to you then, building this micro compounding as a, micro compound that ultimately allows you to then create this momentum, and through this momentum you're then able to be happy. And this is the loop that, I found myself, when I've asked myself, what truly makes me happy on a day-to-day basis, is that micro progression that ultimately leads to that, momentum that snowballs, and that ultimately results as, what has made me, this builder that is happy to just build each and every single day. Because then I'm able to look at it from an outside perspective of, I don't always have to have this big picture or this big massive win in order to be happy. What are the things that I need to do on a daily basis or even an hourly basis that ultimately, allow me to micro progress within my life, and that ultimately results in me being much happier, simply because I'm outputting a lot more, I'm building a lot more, and I'm learning a lot more as well. Because the learning loop or the learning journey just simply never stops. And then the question becomes, how can I learn each and every single day so that what I'm learning ultimately allows me to become more valuable, and through that value I'm able to then translate that value into value that I'm able to output for others as well. And understanding that happiness isn't inspiration, it's proof that you're moving. Happiness, for me at least, and my experience and the people that I've spoken to that build a lot of things, ultimately comes as a result of moving forward and not stagnating. And I was thinking about this a couple minutes ago as I was doing this, and that was understanding that failure or temporary defeat or complete failure only comes as a result of you could say that if you don't have anything in this point in time, if you aren't moving or you aren't progressing, then yes, you can somewhat classify that as failure. But if you are somewhat not in the position that you want to be, but you're ultimately moving and you're progressing, then you're not failing at all, no matter what the external circumstances may look like. As long as you're progressing and you're moving forward, I think that is the number one thing to ultimately do on a day-to-day basis or even an hourly basis. Because if you're progressing, something is definitely gonna hit. You're basically gonna be able to create that momentum, and that momentum is gonna snowball. And I like to believe that the universe is always listening, so make sure that it listens while you're moving forward and just progressing forward each and every single day. And I think that is one of the most important modes, to just make sure that I understand that happiness comes as a result of me moving forward. And it doesn't have to always be the biggest thing. It can be just simply shipping one video a day, and that ultimately is the foundation of how I'm outputting. And I spoke a lot about this in yesterday's previous video, and that was more centered around how I'm thinking about it from a tactical perspective. But today it's just more so looking at it of how it does, how it basically is on a psychological perspective, how it makes me happy, and how building this modes of just compounding actions ultimately fuel the happiness of a builder. And from my experience, this is at least what I've been able to gather. But in my context, or in my specific build, I've been building videos for 112 days plus now, basically 114 if I'm not mistaken. And this ultimately means that I'm outputting videos, systems, and also real output. This ultimately is a result of me just outputting things that, creates those results for me that I may not see today, but ultimately into the future, I know for a fact that they're ultimately gonna snowball. Nothing happens until everything happens is the way that I'm approaching this, because what it's taught me is that the act of shipping daily rewires the way that you think, and it becomes less about how you feel and more about the systems that you've set up, and basically asking the questions of how can I tighten my systems that I'm building on a day-to-day basis that ultimately allow me to keep outputting even when I don't feel like outputting, so that I'm making sure that I'm pulling the right levers that ultimately allow me to just constantly get the results that I'm seeking, and making sure that I'm pushing the needle forward on a day-to-day basis, and making sure that I'm not focusing on motivation, because motivation only lasts so long before it fades, so that I rather just focus on building and showing up each and every single day. If I want to build this grand vision of impacting millions of people and also inspiring them as well, and also building the grand vision of the next generation of backend systems and how systems operate, then I need to make sure that I'm showing up each and every single day, and that I'm also going the extra mile, but I'm also making sure that I'm protecting what ultimately gets me there as well, and also understanding that what actually makes me happy is building each and every single day, and it doesn't always have to be the things that are always big and flashy. It's always understanding that it's the micro things that I do on a day-to-day basis, or even an hourly basis, or even a minute basis, and ultimately builds that momentum that ultimately results in me being a happier builder, from my experience at least. And I've seen this from other people that I have been speaking to and have spoken to. They're like doing their own thing, that they may not say it outright, but ultimately you can see that their happiness as well comes as a result of what it is that they're building on a day-to-day basis, or like I said, an hourly basis as well. But this also means that there are some mechanisms that you can apply, that I also think are super valuable, which are: don't chase momentum, don't chase motivation, chase visible progress. So basically making sure that you're chasing progress that ultimately compounds through time, and is ultimately not super visible in that moment in time, but will ultimately be visible into the future. And build tighter loops. Basically, input today should replace friction tomorrow, understanding that your input that you're inputting today should ultimately result in you reducing the friction that ultimately comes tomorrow. And also understanding that you're tracking reps as well, that you need to make sure that you stack your outputs so that you can see compounding. If you don't see it externally, or if people don't see it externally, that doesn't mean that you can't see it internally. And if you can see it internally, if no one else does, then you need to just stick to your guns, and also make sure that you're tracking your reps, you're understanding what mechanisms these reps are ultimately playing into the big picture vision, and you're also understanding how this fits into your mission as well, because your mission is ultimately going to be what you're driving and what you're waking up each and every single day to build. And you need to make sure that you're ultimately pulling these mechanisms by not chasing motivation, but chasing what is visible or invisible in the short term, but visible in the long term, that not everyone may see, but ultimately you can also see internally as well. And that ultimately leads us to the final thought that I want to leave you guys on, which is ultimately understanding that if I were to sum this up, that motivation fades, progress compounds, and that's the happiness equation. Focusing more on progress and how that progress compounds through time has ultimately been the result of this happiness equation for me. Ultimately understanding that each and every single day that I'm progressing and building things and making sure that things are moving forward, that is ultimately been a result of me just being happier and a happier builder, and just making sure that I'm building value and creating creating value that ultimately transcends, through time, and also impacts other people as well. And I believe that through this has been the most that has ultimately, been able to keep me happy as I've been, building systems and along my journey as well. And I know that this is only gonna, expand into deeper territories as time goes on. And I want to constantly keep on refining this and making sure that, it's up to standard and just picture perfect as time goes on, because I will definitely be adding a lot more to this. But yeah, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my newsletter, which I recently just rolled out. It's the first link in the description. And also make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, on my socials, also in the description if you guys want to connect with me. And yeah, I will see you guys in the next video.